It's very simple now. I just want to introduce my colleague and my friend Leston Havens, professor of psychiatry, the Harvard Medical School, Department of Psychiatry at the Cambridge Hospital. Les? We'll run the videotape now. You want to sit and watch from there? Why don't we just start it then?
Is seen in relationship to the video experience itself. But I stopped it here not primarily for that reason, but just to say that this sort of ends what I thought of as the first phase of the interview, the purpose of which, as I conceptualized it, was to engage her. That is, the purpose was to find her, to locate the person in some way or other. And this was done historically by a sharing that was attempted historically, that is, in terms of her past difficulties, the drug things in particular, the present absence of hope, the difficulties the therapist was having, the difficulties I would have, the imprisonment that her obligation to her therapist and the children to some extent represented. And here it seems to me that the temptation, the danger to avoid is the danger of reassuring her, of seizing on some hope, because that's not where she is at this particular point. And so that in order to avoid that, the historical review constantly seeks to sort of go below her present mood and to measure the depth of her despair. And you see here that it's very difficult to reach the bottom of this woman's discontent. And as this temptation is resisted, the extent of the engagement is hopefully, anyway, extended and maybe a little bit deepened. And as that happens, then when one comes, as I conceive it, as one comes into engagement with the patient, then we begin to find out who it is we're engaged with. And now you hear this list of adjectives, which will be explored more in the next phase of this interview. In this second phase, as I understand it, the person's self-description and affects are reviewed, and here in my experience, here the temptation, the principal mistake that one is drawn into is to collude with the patient's judgment about themselves. And I stopped it at this point because you see here is a nice psychiatric trick we play on patients in which we collude with the punitive superego, because by expecting people to remember, by expecting people even to forget, by imposing this demand on them, by making responsible for them, we then impose another task that they fail at. And we reinforce their sense of inadequacy. And see, I deal with that by moving over beside her and talking about how difficult or often impossible this situation is. And you see other things before that too and afterwards, in which my whole struggle is to avoid reinforcing this attitude she has toward herself. Now this phase is closing out with this garbage collection, you might say, of her self-image that we've made, and now you'll see me moving toward looking for something else. And here our gifted TV guide, Henry Feld, has produced a visual metaphor for the structural aspects of this as I see them. You see, he puts me up in the top right-hand corner, and I'm looking over her shoulder, and so that we can say that I'm now going to make a more pronounced effort to replace her inner object, her punitive superego, if you like, with something more like ego ideal, with some less judgmental, perhaps more empathic self-conception. And so that this visual metaphor, you might say, of of a movement in an internal agency is represented here, I think, very, very vividly indeed. The cigarette is the sign of the cigarette. Doesn't sound that way to me. The cigarette is a sign of the ending of her work, in my opinion. That she has done her part of the interview, and that she's told me the story, and the ball is now in my court as I conceive it. And I have to supply her with something that modifies this view of her that she's helpless to. I have to remoralize or idealize in some way her. So this has to come from outside. She doesn't locate anything within herself which would make that possible. So that by taking the cigarette, I think she said to me, "I'm finished now. Tell me what you're going to do. What are you going to do about this?" Now you'll see as this last part comes on that I try to take a very active responsibility for this. And that's partly to offset her pathological tendency to take too much responsibility for everything. And I'm essentially locating the next move, which will be hopefully something I can suggest to Jan, in the therapist's, as the therapist's responsibility. Is fairly identifiable. That is, it begins. I call this attempt at an engagement, finding the patient, and then a detailing of what is found. And in the first part, the danger is to lighten the engagement by reassurance or grasping for hope or something of that sort. In the second phase, as I said, the danger is occluding with the negative judgment, which are very subtly presented as possibilities by the patient throughout the thing. And then finally, one looks around for somebody new, somebody to develop, reconstruct. I mentioned already that this could be conceptualized structurally in terms of the relationship between the superego and ego ideal. Now, I want to emphasize that this really wholehearted effort to make lovable, you might call it, to make lovable, is necessary, in my opinion, because the kind of the advice we're usually given in cases like this depend upon there being a viable structure already in the patient, able to do, for example, the mourning work, the ejection of the hostile, remembered, ambivalently held figures, that sort of thing. But that in many of these cases, particularly very downtrodden people, essentially supine people who accept their criticisms of their agencies, there's essentially no person present in the patient with whom the therapist can ally to do the psychodynamic work that we've been taught. So that there has to be this often considerable period in which essentially an ally of the work, an ally of the patient, is constructed internally before the more familiar work of remembering and forgetting can go forward.
going to take us just a minute to get the panel assembled, and then we'll move right along, because I know it's getting late. Going with the panel discussion. As I said, what we'll do at this point is panel member 10 minutes to discuss the interview and make whatever comments they want about it. There are two things I need to do before we... the first is to introduce Bowie, who's down at the end of the table. Dr. Bowie is an associate professor of psychiatry at Tufts and a training and supervising analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute. You know Dr. Littman from this morning and Dr. Maltzberger, and they will be making their presentations, as I now look, in the order that they're sitting, with Dr. Bowie going first, and then Dr. Littman, and then Dr. Maltzberger. I know that many of us were expecting and hoping that Dr. Menninger could be on the panel. He is not feeling well. It's not anything to worry about, but he has a minor GI upset, and he thought it'd be best not to push any more today, so we can't include him on the panel, and I'm sorry about that. Dan, I think we can begin with your comments, please.
We didn't have the history to help us in thinking out our remarks, so I made a couple of assumptions. One was that the patient was typical of more poverty-type communities, such as I'm familiar with in South Boston and Dorchester. That may not be true. I also assumed that the addiction had been involving more malicious drugs than the amphetamines, and I could have in my imagination overdrawn the nature of the horrors that her life had involved. Those assumptions don't too much influence what I was going to say anyway, but I want to start with those remarks for orientation. Dr. Havens interviewed a very difficult, chronically suicidal patient. He provided us an example of the best we could hope to give to a patient in psychodynamic understanding, empathic understanding, caring, and technical efforts to help. I would like to present my own view of the recommendation he extended to the patient and Jan Kaufman. My approach will draw on a developmental perspective, on certain elements of his interaction with the patient, and on my experience in community psychiatry in settings of poverty. The patient is a realist. Dr. Havens recognized that she will take him seriously only if he joins her in her realism. He also knew that she was unable to extend herself to him more than a little, especially under circumstances of this interview. So he willingly carried 90% of the initiative and responsibility for their interaction. He and the patient acknowledged that her self-experience and major identity are mostly comprised of emptiness, loneliness, worthlessness, badness, guilt, sin, uselessness, hopelessness. She is a loser. She is the sum total of the horrors of her life. She holds to life tenuously because there is little or no positive meaningfulness intrinsic to her being. Only her children evoke enough sense of meaningfulness and responsibility to justify living. At certain moments, she can stay alive by calling on Jan Kaufman for help. Her realistic view of psychotherapy was just as vital to recognize. The shrinks say the way she can put it all behind her is by talking about it. Talk about it, talk about it, and talk about it some more. But she knows that makes nothing go away. It only brings it all back. I agree with this realism she and Dr. Havens expressed. Sharing the aloneness, grief, hate, horror, and guilt of one's life can bring resolution and perspective only when certain supportive resources are both available to and utilizable by the patient. These resources consist of certain capacities for soothing holding of the self, sensing the realness of good self-qualities, experiencing of self-worth, experiencing of one's genuine positive identity, and loving the self. If a patient possesses these resources as part of her own psychological constitution, she can endure the pain and horror of expressive psychotherapy to a good end. As Simrad put it, she is able to acknowledge, bear, and put into perspective the painful distresses of her life. When a patient does not possess these resources, but has a therapist who can supply them for her, she can still accomplish the therapeutic task, provided she is able to use the caring, the knowing, the respecting, and loving which the therapist offers. Here is the problem for this particular patient, and for many like her. Alienation, self-hate, self-derision, and guilt disallow her making use of what the therapist provides. Standard expressive psychotherapy would overwhelm her and erode whatever hold she has on living. Actually, for a patient so internally deficient and self-destructive as this, expressive psychotherapy would not be endurable even if she were able to utilize the resources offered by the therapist. The intensity of her self-hate, guilt, self-derision, and aloneness would be too excessive to endure between appointments, even if she were seen 5 times a week. This kind of patient must, if there is to be hope for positive change, acquire some capacity to provide for herself the essential functions I have listed. Dr. Havens offered a recommendation. He said, "Could we help you to love yourself? How can we help you feel like your children and grandchildren feel toward you?" His interview implies what, to my mind, is a developmental principle of the greatest significance. Human beings are not able, either in the usual course of development or in delayed development, to evolve the essential capacities I am speaking about simply out of their innate potentials. The consistent and prolonged participation of others is prerequisite. That is, these functions must first be provided by others if an individual is to acquire them as functions he can provide for himself. In the language of psychoanalytic theory, we would say that these functions become part of the patient's own psychological structure through processes of internalization, specifically through introjection and identification. I believe everything I am saying is standard clinical theory, except as it applies to the function of loving the self. This one may be my own idea. Clinical observation convinces me that we are born with the capacity to love other persons spontaneously, but not to love our own selves. We acquire the capacity to love ourselves only through interactions with those who love us. Dr. Havens offered this patient an abundance of the functions she needs. He actively cared about her and made every effort to be with her empathically. He recognized the realities of her life in all their grimness. He observed with her her loving relationships with her children and grandchild, her friendship with Jan Kaufman, and her gratitude for her caring help were acknowledged as real. The patient's sense of responsibility for her life was seen and respected. Esteem was catalyzed in a multitude of ways as he and the patient acknowledged that she is a woman who knows how to control emotions and actions in the best interest of herself and others. She keeps going in the face of very formidable problems. Despite the unfairness of life and certain people, she has not given way to bitterness. She herself is not a stone wall. Rather, she is a woman of courage, stick-to-itiveness, and kindness. Her altruistic and appropriately self-sacrificing ideals for her children, that they be able to live their own lives and take care of themselves, has been accomplished very well. In raising her children, she corrected, in a way, the wrongs that were perpetrated on her as a child. Suicide is very tempting as a way out of her misery, and Dr. Havens admired her for not killing herself because she is concerned about the effect it would have on her children. Even though in her eyes she fails, she nevertheless tries to be a good person and tries not to hurt others. In this interview, the patient's sense of badness and guilt also received the respectful attention it deserved. She resolutely blamed herself as bad for taking drugs, despite saying that she took them because she was so miserable. Dr. Havens said, as if it was something that you chose, as if it was a fault. The patient replied, you have to be kind of weak to take drugs. Dr. Havens employed overemphasis and exaggeration to establish a point of perspective. He said, you were weak, another one of your crimes. That wasn't the worst, was it, of your crimes? You got a list of them a yard long, I'm sure. At a different time in the interview, the patient was able to use the support of reason to ease her guilt a little. She was able to understand that she took drugs in an effort to keep going in the face of life difficulties that were as hard as a stone wall, that she took them in order to cope as a form of self-treatment. The interview demonstrates that the patient can make limited use of the important functions a therapist can supply. But I think she cannot make nearly enough use of them to allow her to develop these functions as part of herself. I think there are two reasons for this limitation. First, her alienation, self-hate, self-derision, and guilt are formidable blocks to accepting loving, understanding, and esteem from another person. Second, her socioeconomic status, education, and life experience are vastly different from those of nearly any psychotherapist. The gulf between them would be too great to allow enough of the kind of internalization that leads to acquiring self-capacities by means of identification. Nevertheless, the individual therapy with Jan Kaufman should certainly continue. It constitutes a successfully established lifeline. In my opinion, another form of therapy should be added, one that I have observed helping patients like this to acquire the self-capacities necessary for their growth beyond a suicidal state. The self-sacrificing ideals for her children, that they be able to live their own lives and take care of themselves, has been accomplished very well. In raising her children, she corrected, in a way, the wrongs that were perpetrated on her as a child. Suicide is very tempting as a way out of her misery, and Dr. Havens admired her for not killing herself because she is concerned about the effect it would have on her children. consists of members who share the same backgrounds, who have long been up against the same kinds of stone walls, who have led similar disastrous lives. The group leader is necessarily a trained therapist, but one who has worked closely enough with the community, who understands and loves these individuals enough that he or she has gained a genuine sense of sharing their lives. The leader's role is confined to catalyzing a group process in which the members increasingly share their life experiences and their inner selves. With this sharing comes caring, loving, and relying on each other for a sense of belonging in a secure, holding environment. While they cannot see much that is esteemable in themselves, they see a great deal to esteem in the others. Eventually, each one finds that the other members she esteems find her worthy too, and their reasons are undeniably sound. With these interactions, development of self-esteem becomes inevitable. Of course, self-hate and guilt must be dealt with. Each member eventually sees clearly that the others were trapped by impossible life circumstances. All their reactions are truly understandable as simply human. There is no reasonable way to hate them for their behaviors or hold them guilty. This perspective on the misdeeds of others cannot for long be denied to the self, especially when one's self is also objectively seen by the group and pronounced as simply human. Group members find themselves loved for reasons that make sense to them, and then they can begin to love themselves in the way they experience being loved. Alienation, aloneness, rage, these progressively fade. I have painted a utopian picture, one that is only approximated in reality. I do not know for sure whether this patient could use such a group, but I have seen it work well enough, and I think it offers a way to approach the recommendation that Dr. Havens has made.
Fairly frequently it happens at the Suicide Prevention Center in Los Angeles that I have the opportunity to interview a patient with the therapist in somewhat similar manner and under somewhat similar circumstances, although I can't recall that I ever was able to do such an effective, efficient, and timely way of interviewing as was demonstrated today by Dr. Havens. But I asked, what was the purpose of this interview, other than educational for all of us? I think it was to help the therapist-patient partnership. After 5 years of doing therapy with a patient that still feels miserable, that has all these negative feelings about herself as a loser, even the most optimistic therapist asks herself, what am I doing wrong, or am I missing something? Or I notice I'm starting to be depressed and worried, and I'm afraid I might get a call. So it's good practice to ask for a consultation, ask for some supervision, and share this case. You're especially lucky, if you're the therapist, if you can share the case with a senior supervisor. It's helpful to do it with almost any one of your peers, as well as the supervisor. In this particular case, I noticed that the focus of the interview was the establishment of contact, of personhood, and a reaching toward identity. There's good reasons for that, but I noticed in passing that the problem of suicide was not really explored according to a checklist. You might come away from this interview feeling that the patient said, I wouldn't commit suicide because it would be so hard on my daughters. And I would not be totally comfortable with that. So I've heard that, and that is a reason. It's a good reason for not committing suicide, but there's a limit to its holding power. And I would want to know if this was being conducted with the idea of evaluation for possible suicide. I would want to know what her plans were, what her fantasies about death and dying were, and her participation were, and if she had a weapon, had thought of a means, had rehearsed it in her mind or in practice, if she'd set a deadline, what was on her mind about the future. What emerged was a feeling on her part of anhedonia, joylessness, somewhat distanced by the idea that it is a depression. So this interview has the function of providing both the patient and the therapist and the consultant with a new outlook and probably an additional infusion of hope in a situation that has acquired characteristics of hopelessness. Now, in a theoretical way, we're thinking that, well, what's our task? We want her, just in general, we want her to extend her real self, that self that we're searching for. Certainly we want her to love herself. But this self we're talking about is a integrated, central self. She's so much involved with her bad self. And she's going to have to understand the bad self, its origins, its memories, and be able to accept it and forgive it. That's part of her task in the therapy. And on the other hand, she has an idealized self that she can't live up to. It involves being a private person. It involves that you don't hurt other people, that you have no hate, that you're a good mother and your children are more than that. There's something ideal, something special. So there is an ideal self that she can't live up to, and she will have to gradually, we hope, give up elements of that ideal self, bring it back to some livable ideals, that she can now bring both the bad and the good into greater and greater conciliation and harmony. But how to do that with a person who's lacking in energy, who feels all worn out, who has no joy? I'm going to take the opposite point of view from Dr. Bowie, knowing nothing about the case as well, and I'm going to assume that her use of drugs, her so-called drug addiction, was iatrogenic and did not involve heroin. It may have involved alcohol, and she's gotten over that. She's given up alcohol. So that we have the knowledge that that her joy pills or her happy pills were amphetamine. Amphetamine has a bad name now, partly because it's persecuted in a paranoid way by the Federal Drug Administration. I want to stand here and say a good word for amphetamine as a therapeutic modality for people that have a sort of primary anhedonia. There are some people that can take amphetamine, they don't become tolerant. It does add a layer of energy and joy into their personality, and they can use it in combination with therapy. At the present time, I have 3 patients who have chronic 20 years of anhedonia, who have been taking amphetamine for many, many years, in 15 to 20 milligram a day doses. They don't become tolerant, they don't lose weight, they don't become excited, and they don't lose sleep. They do feel better and they don't feel depressed, and they function better. That, that happens to be the drug that they need. So that it's possible, cautiously, that this woman might use amphetamine or a whole variety of antidepressant drugs which weren't discussed in this at this particular presentation, but no doubt have been tried in some capacity. I have, as an aside, one of my early cases at the Suicide Prevention Center involved a young man who was in analysis with a colleague, and all through a certain part of his analysis, he said that he was discouraged and depressed and he was going to kill himself on his 21st birthday. He said he would do it with a handgun. And on his 21st birthday, he got in the shower and he put a gun in his mouth and he fired it, meaning to kill himself. However, the bullet took an upward course, took out an eye, may have taken out part of the frontal lobe, but he was living and he found himself standing in the shower, bleeding, wrapped a towel around his head and walked down to a nearby emergency hospital and received treatment. And he went back into analysis. But after a while, he began to say that he now planned to do it on his 22nd birthday again, and this time my colleague became upset and sent him over to see me. And I found the only thing that helped him, he had a bad reaction to antidepressants, but he had a good reaction to amphetamine. He said he discovered that experimenting himself. So I gave him amphetamine. The trouble was that he did develop tolerance. He would have to take more and more, and then he would become psychotic. He'd have a paranoid reaction. He worked for the post office, and he would feel that the FBI was closing in on him, that people were watching him, so I would have to take him off the amphetamine, in which case he'd become profoundly depressed. So I saw him with a colleague. We took turns seeing him because he would become paranoid if just one of us was seeing him. The trick was to get him by his 22nd birthday high on amphetamine. And we accomplished that, Carl Wold and I. And he said, all right. He says, you fooled me. I know what you're doing. All right, I won't do that. He said, all I ask now is that you destroy all my records, any trace I ever was here, and forget me, which we were glad to do. And he went his way. I heard just rumors about him, and about 10 years later, a couple of years ago, I got a letter from him. He said, I'm now a lawyer. I'm in practice. I think I may owe you some money. And I wrote back, no, we're even. It's just fine. Now, what is my point here? My point is, that in a problem like this, one casts about in a pragmatic way for anything that can be helpful. Of course, step one is to have the patient's confidence and keep it. And step two, then, is to look for ways to try to make this patient love herself. It can be done if drugs will help, we'll use some drugs. I think group therapy is a beautiful idea. We use it all the time. At the Suicide Prevention Center, we have a daily group, a drop-in group for whoever wants to come in, plus spin-off groups for people after they've been in the drop-in group several times. Sometimes we try to have a person have several therapists, trying to find the right combination that the person might favor. Sometimes a patient will be calling in to talk to my administrative assistant, Sylvia, and form an attachment to Sylvia, and see me occasionally for a drug prescription and have most of his therapy with my assistant. or whoever that person, or a secretary, or whoever they find in the whole establishment that they seem to form a relationship with. So my emphasis is on flexibility, on personal relationship, and the feeling that there is always hope.
Well, can you hear me? Those members of the audience who were eager to see how Dr. Havens would solve this therapeutic dilemma by some brilliant tour de force and set the patient and her therapist on the right road might have had some sense of frustration in watching this interview. Dr. Havens offers the patient no penetrating interpretations, discovers no evidence of insidious countertransference difficulties, detects no hidden details of losses or other traumas in the patient's history. Instead, he seems almost oddly inactive, self-depreciating at times. This extremely difficult patient makes her hopelessness plain, subtly yet forcibly keeps up her guard and gives him little to work with in the ordinary way of things. But look again, and you will see that Dr. Havens has shown us how an interviewer can, almost against the wishes of the patient, make himself a part of her isolated despair and intrude a hope-giving relationship when the patient thinks that none is possible. How does he do it? First of all, he's quite supportive of the patient's defenses. He does not crowd her for information, even regarding her history. She tells him, "I was shut out and shut up in her childhood." He opens the door for her to remember and to explain, but when she chooses to keep her horrors to herself, her terrible memories, he doesn't press. He avoids pushing in and throwing open the shutters of her mind in order to bustle around and to find out what she chooses to keep to herself. He freely acknowledges and admits the real difficulties in her life, including the fact that she's had a long treatment without great success, that her children are leaving her, that she has, in fact, very little to live for. He tries to make no demands on the patient. If you knew how to like yourself, you wouldn't be sitting here, would you? He doesn't imply that the patient has to figure out a solution for herself. These parts of the interview can be summarized by saying that Dr. Havens is careful to do nothing that would add to the patient's heavy burden of guilt, failure, self-blame, or to her profound sense of incompetence. Now, these are some of the things that he does not do. On the more active side, Dr. Havens tries to relieve the patient's self-scorn by pointing out to her that she is kind to everyone but herself. She calls herself names such as old dog, loser. She scorns herself for drug taking, for being bad. She's guilty of crimes. Dr. Havens gently apologizes to the patient for herself, suggesting that the drugs were her treatment, her tranquilizer, that she has reasons for keeping her thoughts and feelings to herself. The only part of the patient with which she disagrees is the enemy alien which she carries within, a hating, carping presence. Over the course of history, these interior enemies that plague people have been given a variety of names: demon, dybbuk, evil conscience, superego, hostile introject. This is the only part of the patient on which Dr. Havens puts some pressure. And those of us familiar with the psychotherapy of depression will be reminded of an important set of maneuvers that are employed. One draws attention to the patient's hostile self-attitude, tries to help the patient gain some distance from it, and hopes ultimately to try and pit the patient against it in an effort to dethrone it as a tin pot tyrant. Sometimes this maneuvering works, but sometimes it doesn't. It almost always lends the patient some comfort, however. And I suspect that this line in today's interview was one of the factors that made the patient say, "Dr. Havens is kind." He would not go along with her self-attack, but offered her some comfort. He sheltered her for a while from the inner artillery barrage, if you will. There's something else here, however, that I found quite striking. Did you notice how Dr. Havens systematically joins the patient in her sense of worthlessness by a gentle mockery of psychiatry? He is a realist, I know. But here we see a greater than usual degree of the usual Haven-esque diffidence about the powers and capacities of mental science. "Oh, what we don't know," he tells her. You remember other such mild psychiatry depreciating remarks. What he's doing, of course, is guessing what the devaluative, angry attitudes must be that the patient is harboring against the caretakers somewhere in her private self. And he takes them up insofar as he can in an emotionally honest way and owns them for himself. I think that this maneuver helps him join the patient in spite of herself, brings him close to the suffering core of herself that she seems so determined to reserve away from the intrusion of others. He will not leave the patient alone in spite of herself. He does not try to take her fortress by storm, but quietly creeps into it by joining her in the feeling of hopelessness and buying off her secret attack on psychiatrists that have failed her. In the end, when she is all too willing to hand over to him the responsibility for the dilemma of her life, he does not quail, but accepts it good-humoredly and goes off to do his homework. At the close of the interview, we realize that we have been shown how it is possible to get into a relationship with a person who wants none, a person living at the edge of despair. No lecturing, no pep talk, no hectoring. Acknowledgement of failure, acknowledgement of hopelessness, eager participation in the dilemma, willingness to accept a heavy load of responsibility, and a defense of the patient from an inner enemy, her conscience. Perhaps Dr. Havens has achieved something of a tour de force after all. What is not evident from the film is something that I know nevertheless, and that is that Les Havens would be prepared to go on like this, where the patient is, for hours and hours, not giving up hope, but waiting for some spontaneous movement. Dr. Simrad used to say of Frieda from Reich that little old lady kept coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back until the patient couldn't stand it anymore. And something had to give. He also used to say that if you will stay with somebody like this and stay with them and stay with them, that the moment comes when the patient will say, you know, if this person can stand me so much, and can be so caring and so interested in me, maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe I've got something that I can't see that he can. So one waits for spontaneous movement. And it's somewhere there, when the necessary internalization has taken place, maybe some more conventional therapeutic maneuvers will become possible, like grieving or what have you. But you can't be in a hurry. What's the most unbearable thing to suicidal patients? Well, as I've already said, a strong argument can be made that what lies behind their despair is an incapacity to bear two highly corrosive affects, worthlessness and aloneness. To repeat, by worthlessness, I'm referring to a variety of self-contempt different from ordinary depressive low self-esteem. I'm referring instead to a mental state in which the patient feels divided. One part of the self suffers and cowers before another part of the self that is aloof, scornful, and pitiless. By aloneness, I'm not referring to ordinary loneliness, but to that state of inner isolation that is accompanied by varying degrees of fear and horror, and that can sometimes verge on panic. Most of us have very little experience of these affects, and in that we are very fortunate. Those whose development or whose biology renders them vulnerable to such feelings have to depend on outside resources for neutralization of the pain to fight off the horrors. That is why so many suicidal patients seem so demanding. They have to have others to relieve them because they cannot relieve themselves. Another person who serves the purpose of warding off or relieving the pain is known these days in some quarters as a self-object. Maybe a better term would be the self-sustaining object, because without some such resource, the suicide vulnerable person is in danger of self-collapse or narcissistic collapse. With the wisdom of the serpent and the gentleness of the dove, Les Havens has fashioned himself into exactly and specific the right kind of self-object here that is best suited to sustain the patient. He shields her from self-contempt and steals into her isolation. By sharing her hopelessness and acknowledging the ineptitude of his profession to find an easy solution, he pointedly does not leave her alone. In concluding, let me recur to something I said in the opening. I suggested that some of us might feel a sense of frustration at what seemed inactive. I was hinting at a common countertransference reaction such patients are likely to call up in us all, and that is a strong wish for action. Sitting with such patients makes us feel helpless. Watching that patient on the video screen made me feel very helpless. The wish to find a super expert with the big magic dies hard. Perhaps some of you, like me, in watching that film, still long for some of the magic, something powerful and active to use against the hopelessness. Patients like these infect us with helplessness, despair. We want secretly despair. We want to help them fast in order to help ourselves. And I think as I came to that film and saw that patient, I said to myself, well, is Les going to have the spell, the magic for a quick solution? Well, he didn't offer us a quick fix in this interview, but I'm satisfied that he offered the patient the very best that there is available. He did not offer us a tour de force, but he did offer us a tour d'amour. And he's offered us a chance to learn. He did not, as therapists are sometimes tempted to do, especially when on view before large audiences or groups of students, give in to a need to show us that he's not helpless, or to show the patient that he's not responsible for her dilemma, but she is. Nowhere in this remarkable tape is there a hint that Dr. Havens is having to separate himself from the patient in order to reassure himself or us or the patient that he is not the hopeless, inept, inadequate one. The only inference possible is that at least for the duration of this interview, Leston Havens has the capacity to acknowledge, bear, and keep in perspective his share of worthlessness and aloneness in the face of the possible death of this woman without separating himself from or further burdening her. Thank you.